The cold came first. That is what I remember when I try to trace back to the beginning before I understood what ownership truly meant. The cold of the processing chamber where I stood naked among 47 others, stripped of our names and our clothing and whatever illusions we had carried about the nature of our lives. I was 23 years old. I had been a maintenance worker in Hive Tertius, level 47, born to a father who repaired water reclamation units and a mother who died when I was 6 from lung rot. I thought I understood hardship. I thought I knew what it meant to be small and insignificant in the vast machinery of the Imperium. I knew nothing. My name was Garrett Holloway then. I still remember it, though the memory grows strange now, like watching someone else's life through a dirty window. The debt was not mine, not originally. My father had borrowed from the wrong sources to pay for treatments that never worked, and when he died 3 months after my mother, the debt passed to me like a hereditary disease. I worked for 11 years to pay it down. I lived in a coffin-sized hab unit, ate nutrient paste mixed with recycled proteins, took double shifts whenever they were offered. I was careful. I was responsible. It did not matter. The interest compounded faster than any human labor could match, and on my 23rd birthday, the administratum officials came to inform me that my debt had been sold to the Mechanicus. I did not understand what this meant. None of us did. The 47 who stood in that processing chamber on the transport ship carrying us away from everything we had ever known. We had heard stories, of course. Everyone in the hive had heard stories about the tech priests, their machines, their rituals, their complete indifference to human comfort or suffering. But stories are abstractions. They do not prepare you for the reality of standing before a robed figure whose face has been replaced entirely by a bronze mask, whose voice emerges from a vox grill set into what was once a throat, whose hands end in mechanical appendages that click and whir with autonomous purpose. The Magos who bought us was designated Epsilon Vex Tertius. I would later learn that this was not a name in any human sense, but a classification number, a position within the endless hierarchy of the cult Mechanicus. He served a forge world called Covax Primaris, a place I had never heard of, a place that would become the only world I would ever know again. He moved through the processing chamber with the smooth, inhuman grace of something that had long ago forgotten the limitations of flesh, and when he stopped before each of us, his optical sensors would glow brighter for a moment as he assessed our value. Most of us were dismissed with a wave of those clicking mechanical fingers, sent to other chambers, other processing lines, other fates I would never learn. But when he stopped before me, something different happened. The optical sensors remained bright for longer than seemed necessary. I felt the beam of red light passing over my body like a physical touch, and I fought the urge to cover myself, to shrink away, to show the fear that was screaming inside my chest. I stood still. I said nothing. I had already learned that silence was the only protection available to the powerless. This one, the Magos said, and his voice was nothing like a human voice, each syllable precisely modulated, stripped of emotion or inflection, yet somehow carrying a weight that made my stomach turn to ice. Designation confirmed. Acquisition approved. This property will accompany me to primary laboratorium. Property. That was the first time I heard myself described that way. It would not be the last. They gave me a robe then, a shapeless garment of rough brown fabric that smelled of oil and something chemical I could not identify. They gave me sandals with metal soles that clicked against the deck plates as I walked. They gave me a designation that replaced my name, Unit Garrett Tertius 7. I did not know then why they preserved any part of my original identity. Most Mechanicus property received only numbers, but the Magos had specified that my given name should be incorporated, and what the Magos specified became law. I would learn the reason eventually. I would learn it was not kindness. The journey to Covax Primaris took 7 weeks in the warp. I spent most of that time in a cargo hold, with other acquired property, learning the rules that would govern my new existence. We were fed twice daily through feeding tubes that extended from the ceiling at precisely scheduled intervals. We were permitted to eliminate waste through designated grates in the floor. We were not permitted to speak except during designated communication periods, which occurred for exactly 30 minutes each day. We were monitored at all times by servitors whose dead eyes and slack faces reminded us constantly of what happened to property that failed to perform its function adequately. I learned to count during those weeks. Not numbers, I already knew numbers. I learned to count time by the rhythm of the ship, the subtle vibrations that passed through the deck plates at regular intervals, the cycles of the lighting that dimmed and brightened according to some pattern I never fully understood. I learned to count breaths, heartbeats, the seconds between feeding cycles. Counting became my anchor. Counting would become something else entirely in the years ahead, but in those early weeks, it was simply a way to hold on to something real, something I could control, when everything else had been stripped away. When we finally emerged from the warp and began our approach to Kovacs Primaris, I was permitted to view the world through a small porthole in the cargo hold. I wish I had not looked. The planet was a sphere of rust and shadow, its surface covered entirely by structures of black metal and smoking industrial towers that rose like diseased fingers toward a sky permanently stained orange by chemical clouds. There was no green, no blue, no color that suggested anything living had ever existed there. Only metal, only machines, only the endless, grinding industry of the cult Mechanicus. The Magos was waiting when they brought me down from the transport. He stood in a receiving bay the size of a cathedral, surrounded by robed acolytes and lesser tech priests who moved with the synchronized precision of components in a great machine. His optical sensors fixed on me the moment I emerged from the processing line, and I felt something I had not felt since childhood, a sensation of being truly seen, of being the focus of attention from something so much larger and more powerful than myself that my existence felt like an offense against nature. "Unit Garrett," he said, and I was surprised that he used my designation directly, speaking to me rather than through intermediaries as I had expected. "You have been selected for specialized function. You will accompany me to primary laboratorium. You will be assigned quarters adjacent to my workspace. You will perform duties as specified. Do you understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Verbal confirmation required. "Do you understand?" "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, cracked and dry from weeks of disuse. "I understand. Excellent. Compliance confirmed. Beginning integration protocol." I did not know what integration protocol meant. I would learn. The laboratorium was a vast space deep within the forge complex, a chamber filled with machines I could not name or understand, their purposes hidden behind casings of bronze and iron that hummed with contained power. The Magos worked here constantly, his many mechanical limbs manipulating tools and components with a precision that no human hand could match. I was assigned a small alcove near the entrance, a space barely large enough to contain the thin sleeping pallet, and the nutrient dispenser that would sustain me. I was given duties, cleaning the laboratorium floor, disposing of waste materials, fetching components from storage when the Magos required them. Simple tasks, menial tasks, tasks that could have been performed by any servitor. I did not question why a Magos of his rank would use a human for such work. I did not question anything. Questions were not permitted for property. The first month passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. I learned the rhythms of the laboratorium, the times when the Magos would be working and the times when he would enter a state of dormancy that I hesitated to call sleep. I learned which components he used most frequently, where they were stored, how to retrieve them quickly and efficiently. I learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to become invisible except when my function required visibility. I thought I was adapting. I thought I was surviving. Then came the night when I woke to find the Magos standing over my pallet, his optical sensors glowing in the darkness like twin red stars. "Unit Garrett," he said, and there was something in his modulated voice that I had not heard before, something that might have been curiosity if machines were capable of such emotions. "Your integration proceeds adequately, physical parameters within acceptable range. Psychological indicators suggest sufficient compliance conditioning, but one element remains to be addressed." I sat up slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs. What element? You retain excessive attachment to biological identity markers, name, memory, self-concept. These attachments will impede optimal function as integration deepens, therefore a gift. He extended one of his mechanical limbs, and in its grip was a small object that I could not immediately identify. It was made of metal, approximately the size of my thumb, with a surface that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light of the laboratorium. When I looked more closely, I saw that it was engraved with the Mechanicus symbol and a series of numbers that matched my designation. A cognitive marker, the Magos explained, implanted beneath the dermis of the left temple. It will interface with neural pathways to provide enhanced memory organization and emotional regulation. You will find your duties easier to perform. You will find your previous attachments easier to release. This is a gift. It is also mandatory. I stared at the implant in his metal fingers. I understood in that moment that this was the beginning of something I could not reverse. The cleaning, the fetching, the menial labor, those had been tests, conditioning, preparation for this moment when the true work of transforming me would begin. When? I asked, because I could not think of any other question. Now. The procedure is brief. Pain management will not be provided, as pain serves important calibration functions. Remain still. He did not wait for my consent. Consent was not a concept that applied to property. His limbs moved with terrible precision, and I felt something cold press against my temple, and then there was pain beyond anything I had experienced in my life, a white-hot lance that seemed to pierce directly into my brain, and I screamed until my voice gave out, and still he worked, adjusting, calibrating, ensuring that the implant was positioned exactly where it needed to be. When it was over, I lay on my pallet in a pool of my own sweat, my head throbbing with every heartbeat, my vision swimming with after-images of red and white. The Magos stood over me still, observing, his optical sensors unchanged in their cool intensity. "Integration checkpoint 1 complete," he said. "Rest now. Tomorrow your training begins." He turned and glided away into the depths of the laboratorium, leaving me alone with the pain and the terrible new sensation of something foreign living inside my skull. I reached up with trembling fingers and felt the small bump beneath my skin, the cold hardness of metal where there had been only flesh before, and in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that the Magos had not simply purchased my labor or my time. He had purchased me completely and absolutely, down to the neurons that fired inside my brain. I slept eventually, though my dreams were strange, fragmented things full of numbers and diagrams and mechanical sounds I did not recognize. When I woke, the pain had faded to a dull ache, and I found that I could not remember my mother's face. I could remember that I had a mother. I could remember that she had died when I was 6. But the specific image of her face, the way her eyes had looked or the shape of her smile, those details were simply gone, as if someone had excised them from my mind with surgical precision. I told myself it was the trauma of the procedure. I told myself the memories would return. I was wrong. The training the Magos had mentioned began immediately. It was nothing like the menial labor I had performed before. Instead, I was taken to a separate chamber within the laboratorium complex, a room filled with cogitator terminals and data slates and projectors that displayed endless streams of information in languages I did not understand. A lesser tech priest was assigned to instruct me, a being whose augmentations were less extensive than the Magos, but still far beyond any human I had known. His designation was Row 7, and he spoke to me with the patient condescension of someone explaining concepts to a particularly dim child. "You have been selected for a specialized function," Row 7 explained during our first session. "The Magos requires an assistant capable of interfacing with biological subjects during experimental procedures. Servitors are inadequate for this purpose, as their cognitive degradation prevents accurate observation of subtle biological responses. A human assistant is required. You have been deemed suitable. What kind of experimental procedures?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. "That information is classified beyond your current authorization level. You will learn as needed. For now, You will study, you will memorize, you will demonstrate competence in the following areas. The list was extensive: anatomy, both human and various xenos species whose names I was not permitted to speak aloud; biochemistry with particular emphasis on neural pathways and endocrine systems; pain response metrics and their measurement; consciousness thresholds and their manipulation; transformation protocols for biological mechanical interface development. The language was clinical, precise, stripped of any acknowledgement that the subjects of these procedures might be thinking, feeling beings. I studied, I memorized, I demonstrated competence. The implant in my temple seemed to help, organizing information into neat categories that I could access with surprising ease. When I struggled to understand a concept, I would feel a subtle pulse from the implant, and suddenly the confusion would clear, replaced by comprehension that felt almost natural. I should have been grateful. Instead, I found myself wondering what else the implant was doing inside my head, what other changes were occurring beneath the surface of my awareness. Weeks became months. My training continued. I learned to observe biological subjects with clinical detachment, to record data without emotional interference, to assist in procedures that would have horrified me in my previous life but now seemed simply routine. I learned the names of machines and their purposes, the rituals that accompanied each activation, the prayers to the machine god that the Magos and his acolytes chanted before every significant operation. I learned that pain was a tool, that consciousness was a variable, that the line between human and machine was not a line at all, but a spectrum that could be traversed in either direction. And I learned about the others. There were 11 of us who served the Magos in various capacities. I was the newest. The oldest was a woman named designation Martha Tertius -2, who had served for 17 years and whose augmentations had progressed far beyond mine. When I first saw her in the maintenance corridors outside the laboratorium, I almost did not recognize her as human. Her left arm had been replaced entirely by a mechanical limb that extended in 3 segments, each capable of independent movement. Her right eye was a glowing red optical sensor identical to those the Magos used. Cables emerged from the base of her skull and connected to a power unit mounted on her back. She moved with the same smooth, inhuman grace that I had observed in the tech priests. "You are the new one," she said when we first spoke, and her voice had a strange harmonic quality that I later learned came from a Vox implant in her throat. "Unit Garrett, the Magos has shown particular interest in your development." "Why?" I asked. "I am nothing special. I was a maintenance worker. I have no valuable skills." Martha made a sound that might have been laughter, though it came out as a series of mechanical clicks. "Skills are irrelevant. The Magos does not select property for skills. Skills can be taught. He selects for compatibility, neural architecture, psychological plasticity, the capacity to accept transformation without catastrophic rejection. You must have tested highly in these areas. That is why you received the cognitive marker so early. Most of us waited years before our first implant." I touched the bump at my temple without thinking. "How many implants do you have?" I stopped counting at 23. The count is no longer meaningful. The implants have integrated with each other, formed networks within my body that function as unified systems rather than discrete components. I'm approximately 43% mechanical by mass, though the boundaries between flesh and machine have become difficult to define. I stared at her, trying to see the woman she had been 17 years ago, trying to imagine myself standing where she stood now. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange numbness, a disconnection from the fear that I knew I should be experiencing. The implant pulsed softly at my temple, and I understood that this was its function, to smooth away the rough edges of emotion, to make the unacceptable acceptable. "Does it hurt?" I asked. Pain is recalibrated with each augmentation. What once registered as agony now barely registers at all. The nervous system adapts, the mind adapts, everything adapts, or it is discarded. She paused, her optical sensor whirring as it focused on my face. You are afraid. That is normal at your stage. The fear will pass. Everything passes." She turned and walked away, her mechanical limbs clicking against the metal floor with each step, and I watched her go with the certainty that I was looking at my own future. The second implant came 3 months later, a neural interface port at the base of my skull, allowing direct connection to certain approved cogitator systems. The procedure was performed by the Magos himself, and this time I did not scream, though the pain was no less intense. I simply lay still and counted, counting each second of agony as it passed, counting until the numbers lost meaning and became simply sounds in my head, a mantra that carried me through the darkness. When I recovered, I found that I could interface directly with the data slates in the laboratorium, absorbing information faster than reading would ever have allowed. I found that I could sense the operation of nearby machines, feel their rhythms and frequencies like a second heartbeat. I found that I had lost more memories, this time of my father, specific moments we had shared that were now simply blank spaces where emotion should have been. I did not mourn. The capacity for mourning had been neatly excised along with the memories themselves. A year passed, 2 years, 3. The implants accumulated, each one taking something from me and giving something in return. My left hand was replaced after an accident in the laboratorium, an accident that I later realized had been deliberately engineered to justify the augmentation. The new hand was faster, stronger, more precise than flesh had ever been, and when I looked at it, I sometimes forgot that it had ever been anything else. My eyes were enhanced with optical filters that allowed me to perceive spectrums beyond normal human vision. My ears were modified to hear frequencies that would have been silent before. My heart was reinforced with mechanical components that regulated its rhythm with perfect consistency, and through it all I continued to assist the Magos in his work. The experiments were the core of everything. They took place in a sealed chamber at the heart of the laboratorium, a room I had not been permitted to enter during my first year of service. When I was finally granted access, I understood why it had been hidden from me. The chamber contained holding cells along its walls, each one occupied by a biological subject in various stages of transformation. Some were still recognizably human, their augmentations limited to visible implants and external connections. Others had progressed far beyond that, their bodies twisted and modified into configurations that served purposes I could only guess at. And some, the ones in the cells at the far end of the chamber, had been transformed so completely that calling them human would have been a lie. The great work, the Magos explained, his voice resonant with something that approached reverence. The boundary between flesh and machine is not a limitation but an opportunity. Each subject provides data, each procedure refines technique, each transformation brings us closer to understanding the optimal integration of biological and mechanical systems. You will assist in documenting results. You will assist in monitoring subject responses. You will assist in maintaining experimental parameters. Do you understand? I looked at the subjects in their cells, their eyes, those who still had eyes, following my movement with expressions I could not read. I felt the pulse of my implants, the steady rhythm of my mechanical heart, the cool interface of metal against flesh at a dozen different points on my body. I understood that I was looking at possible futures, paths I might be directed to travel depending on the Magos' needs and preferences. I understand, I said. Excellent, compliance confirmed. Begin documentation protocol for Subject 7. Subject 7 was a man approximately my age, though it was difficult to determine such things after the modifications he had undergone. His torso had been opened and filled with mechanical components that pulsed and whirred with autonomous function. His arms had been removed and replaced with extensive mechanical limbs that included tools I recognized from the laboratorium. His face was still mostly human, and his eyes tracked my approach with an intensity that made my remaining organic flesh crawl. Document current status, the Magos instructed. Neural integration level, motor function efficiency, pain response calibration, consciousness maintenance threshold. I retrieved my data slate and began the documentation process, interfacing directly through my neural port to accelerate the data transfer. The numbers flowed through me, cold and precise, stripping the subject of his humanity and reducing him to metrics and measurements. I did not look at his eyes again. I did not allow myself to wonder what he had been before, what name he had carried, what life he had lived. I documented, I observed, I maintained experimental parameters. This became my function. The months blurred together, marked only by procedures and implants and the steady erosion of everything I had been. I learned to predict the Magos's requirements, to prepare equipment before it was requested, to monitor subjects with a efficiency that earned his approval. I learned the patterns of the laboratorium, the rhythms of the great work, the endless cycle of acquisition and transformation and documentation that drove everything forward. I learned to stop counting the things I had lost, because counting required remembering, and remembering had become increasingly difficult. But there were moments of clarity, breaks in the numbing routine when something would pierce through the careful conditioning and remind me that I was still, in some small way, human. One such moment came during my 5th year of service when I was assigned to monitor a new subject during initial integration procedures. The subject was a young man, perhaps 18 years old, who had been acquired from a cargo ship that had strayed too close to the Forge World's interdiction zone. He was still fully human, still capable of normal speech and movement, still possessed of the wild-eyed terror that I remembered from my own early days. When I entered his holding cell to begin the monitoring protocol, he spoke to me directly, desperately, his words tumbling over each other in his panic. "Please," he said, "please help me. I know you can understand me. I can see it in your eyes. You are still human, at least partly. Please, you have to help me escape." I looked at him, this boy who reminded me so strongly of someone I could not quite remember, and I felt something stir in the depths of my conditioned mind. A flicker of recognition, a ghost of emotion that had long ago been surgically excised. I opened my mouth to respond, and for a moment I did not know what I would say. Then the implant at my temple pulsed, and the flicker died, and I heard myself speaking in a voice that no longer sounded like my own. Subject integration will proceed according to established protocol. Resistance is counterproductive. Acceptance will minimize unnecessary suffering. Please remain still for initial scanning procedures. The boy's face crumpled, hope giving way to despair as he realized that he would find no ally in me. I watched his transformation over the following months, documenting each procedure, recording each modification, noting his pain responses as they were gradually recalibrated from agony to tolerance to something approaching acceptance. By the time his integration reached 40%, he no longer spoke of escape. By the time it reached 60%, he no longer spoke at all, his vocal cords having been replaced by a Vox unit that produced only authorized communication. I watched him become what I was becoming, and I felt nothing, or almost nothing. The thing I did feel, the one thread of experience that the implants had not managed to sever, was curiosity, specifically curiosity about the Magos himself, about the purpose that drove his experiments, about why he had selected me for specialized function when there were countless others who could have served the same role. Martha had spoken of compatibility, of neural architecture and psychological plasticity, but there had to be more. The Magos devoted significant resources to my training, my augmentation, my development. He permitted me access to chambers and information that other property never saw. He spoke to me directly, which was unusual for a tech priest of his rank. There was a purpose to his actions, a design I could not see. I began to search for answers during the brief periods when my duties did not require my attention. I searched carefully, cautiously, aware that the Magos monitored everything within his domain and that discovery would mean consequences I preferred not to imagine. But the curiosity drove me forward, an itch that my conditioning could not fully suppress, and eventually my searching led me to a restricted archive in a subsection of the laboratorium that I had never been permitted to enter. The archive was sealed with protections that should have been beyond my capabilities to bypass. But my augmentations had progressed further than I realized, and the neural interface port at the base of my skull granted me access to systems that I had never consciously attempted to penetrate. When I connected to the archive's cogitator, I felt its resistance, felt the barriers between myself and the information I sought, and then I felt those barriers dissolve, collapsing before the combined processing power of my organic brain and its mechanical enhancements. What I found inside changed everything. The archive contained the Magos' research notes, centuries of documentation stretching back to before my birth, before my parents' births, before the construction of the hive where I had lived my brief human life. The notes detailed his experiments in biological mechanical integration, the successes and failures, the principles he had developed and refined over generations of work. But more importantly, the notes detailed his purpose, the goal toward which all his experiments had been aimed. The Magos was dying, not in the immediate sense, not the way a normal human would understand dying. His mechanical components were eternal, capable of indefinite operation with proper maintenance. But his organic brain, the core of his consciousness that made him more than a simple machine, had begun to degrade despite every intervention. The same process that affected all organic tissue was slowly claiming the one part of him that could not be replaced. Within approximately 40 years, his neural architecture would deteriorate to the point where consciousness could no longer be sustained, unless he found another solution. The research notes described his work toward that solution in clinical detail. He was searching for a way to transfer consciousness, to move the essential self from one neural substrate to another, to achieve true immortality by jumping from brain to brain as vessels wore out. The process required a compatible recipient, someone whose neural architecture was sufficiently similar to his own that the transfer could occur without catastrophic information loss, someone whose mind had been carefully prepared through years of implantation and conditioning, someone whose original identity had been gradually erased to make room for the consciousness that would replace it, someone like me. I stared at the words on the screen, feeling the pulse of my implants, the steady rhythm of my mechanical heart, the cold interface of metal against flesh. I had been selected not for labor, not for documentation, not for any of the functions I had been taught to perform. I had been selected as a vessel. The Magos intended to pour himself into me, to erase what remained of Garrett Holloway and take up residence in my carefully prepared body. Every augmentation had been designed to make me compatible. Every procedure had been calibrated to match his systems. Every memory I had lost had been cleared to make space for his. I was not being transformed into a servant of the Mechanicus. I was being transformed into the next iteration of the Magos himself. The revelation should have provoked horror, despair, a desperate determination to escape or fight back. Instead, I felt the implant at my temple pulse, felt the emotional regulation systems engage, felt my reactions smoothing out into something cold and analytical. I processed the information, I evaluated the implications, I considered my options, and I found that I did not know what I wanted, the part of me that was still Garrett Holloway, the fragment of identity that had somehow survived years of conditioning and augmentation, screamed silently in the depths of my mind. That part wanted to run, to tear the implants from my body, to throw myself into the void rather than become a vehicle for another's consciousness. But that part was small now, diminished, outnumbered by the mechanical systems that processed my thoughts and regulated my responses. The larger part of me, the part that had been carefully cultivated over years of integration, felt something closer to acceptance. What was I, really, except a collection of experiences and memories that had been steadily erased? What would I lose when the transfer occurred, except the final threads of an identity that was already more absence than presence? The Magos was brilliant, ancient, possessed of knowledge and purpose that I could never match. Perhaps becoming him would not be a loss but an elevation. Perhaps the consciousness that would inhabit this body after the transfer would look back on Garrett Holloway the way I now looked back on my own childhood, as a primitive precursor to something more evolved. I disconnected from the archive and returned to my quarters in a state of numb contemplation. I did not speak of what I had learned. I did not change my behavior or my routines. I continued to perform my duties, to document experiments, to monitor subjects, to assist in the great work. But now I watched the Magos with new eyes, seeing not my master but my eventual replacement, the being who would one day wear my body as his own. And I waited. 3 more years passed. My augmentations continued, each one bringing me closer to the compatibility threshold that the transfer would require. I underwent procedures that would have killed me in my original state. My body rebuilt piece by piece into a vessel capable of containing a consciousness far more complex than my own. I lost more memories, more emotions, more of the qualities that had once defined me as Garrett Holloway. I gained new capabilities, new senses, new ways of interfacing with the machines that surrounded me. I became less human and more something else. Something that had no name because no word had been created to describe what I was becoming. But I also watched. I observed. I learned. The Magos was not as invulnerable as he appeared. His degradation was. Accelerating, the organic portions of his brain declining faster than his projections had anticipated. I could see it in subtle ways. Hesitations in his movements, minor errors in his calculations, moments when his normally flawless precision wavered slightly before correcting itself. He was running out of time. The transfer would have to occur sooner than planned. And there was something else, something I discovered during a routine maintenance procedure in the deep archives of the laboratorium, another set of notes, hidden even more carefully than the first. Notes that described not one potential transfer recipient but 3, notes that revealed I was not the only vessel being prepared. Martha and another property designated unit Benjamin Tertius 4 were also candidates. The Magos had been cultivating multiple options, hedging his bets against the possibility that one vessel might fail or prove incompatible. We were not unique. We were not special. We were simply alternatives, redundant systems in his plan for immortality. This revelation provoked something that my emotional regulation systems could not entirely suppress, not horror exactly, not anger. Something stranger, more complex, an emotion I could not name because it did not fit any category I had been taught. I was property. I had accepted this. I had accepted that my purpose was to serve, that my body was not my own, that my transformation was inevitable. But there was a difference between being consumed and being discarded, between having your sacrifice mean something and being a backup plan that might never be used. I found myself wondering which of us he would choose. I found myself wondering if there was a way to influence that choice. And most disturbingly, I found myself wondering if I wanted to be chosen. The answer came in the form of a catastrophe. It began during a routine experiment, a consciousness transfer test using 2 lesser subjects who had been prepared for sacrifice. The procedure was meant to prove the viability of the technique, to demonstrate that consciousness could be moved from one brain to another without fatal information loss. But something went wrong. The equipment malfunctioned, or the subjects were incompatible, or some variable that the Magos had not accounted for disrupted the delicate process. Instead of a clean transfer, there was a catastrophic cascade, neural feedback that propagated through the connected systems and reached the Magos himself through his interface connections. I was present when it happened. I watched as his mechanical body convulsed, as his optical sensors flickered wildly, as sounds emerged from his Vox grill that were not words but screaming static. I watched as his acolytes rushed to disconnect him, to isolate the damage, to stabilize whatever remained of his consciousness. And I watched as they failed. The Magos did not die, not entirely. His mechanical systems remained functional, maintained by autonomous processes that required no conscious direction. But his consciousness, the core of awareness that had driven his great work for centuries, had been shattered by the feedback. What remained was fragments, broken pieces of identity that no longer cohered into a unified self. He could speak, sometimes, in words that made no sense. He could move, sometimes, in patterns that served no purpose. But the being that had purchased me, trained me, prepared me for consumption, That being was effectively gone. I stood in the laboratorium and looked at the shell of my master, and I felt the implants in my body humming with their quiet, constant rhythm. The emotional regulation systems were working hard, suppressing reactions that would have overwhelmed my organic components. But they could not suppress everything. They could not suppress the question that rose unbidden in my augmented mind. What now? The answer came from an unexpected source. Martha found me in the laboratorium 3 days after the catastrophe, while I was still struggling to process the implications of the Magos's collapse. She moved differently now, more quickly, more purposefully, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the mechanical patience that had characterized our previous conversations. "The hierarchy has made its decision," she said. "The Magos's work will continue. A successor will be appointed from among his senior acolytes. But the transfer research will be suspended indefinitely. It was considered too dangerous, too unstable. We will not be used as vessels." I looked at her, at the optical sensor that had replaced her eye, at the mechanical limbs that extended from her modified torso. "What will happen to us? We will continue to serve. Our augmentations are too valuable to waste. We will be assigned to the new Magos, whoever that turns out to be. Our function will change, but we will remain property. Property." The word echoed in my mind, carrying meanings it had not carried before. I had spent 8 years being transformed into a vessel for another's consciousness. That purpose had defined everything about my existence, every augmentation and modification and procedure I had undergone. Now that purpose was gone. I was a vessel with nothing to fill me, a container designed for contents that would never arrive. I should have felt relief. The transfer would not happen. Garrett Holloway, or what remained of him, would not be erased to make room for the Magos, but relief was not what I felt. What I felt was something closer to emptiness, a void where purpose should have been. "You are troubled," Martha observed, her optical sensor whirring as it studied my face. "You have learned something that the rest of us did not know. You have learned what we were truly meant for." I nodded, not bothering to deny it. The cognitive marker in my temple had long ago stripped away my capacity for effective deception. "I learned also," she said, "years ago. It changed nothing. We are property. Our purpose is assigned, not chosen. Whether we serve as vessels or as assistants or as experimental subjects, the fundamental truth remains the same. We do not belong to ourselves." "Then why do you seem different now?" I asked. "Why do you seem almost relieved?" Martha made that clicking sound that served as her laughter. "Because the alternative was worse. Being erased entirely, having our consciousness replaced by another's, losing even the illusion of selfhood that we retain. This outcome preserves something, a fragment, a remnant, something that can continue to experience, to exist, even if that existence is defined by service." I considered her words, turning them over in my augmented mind. She was right, in a sense. Continued existence as property was better than cessation of existence through transfer. But her words also contained an assumption that I was not sure I shared, the assumption that preservation of self, even diminished self, was inherently valuable. I had lost so much over the past 8 years. Memories, emotions, physical components, the very neural architecture that defined who I had been. What remained was not Garrett Holloway in any meaningful sense. It was a construct, a hybrid of organic and mechanical systems that carried Garrett Holloway's designation, but little of his essence. Would it have been worse to lose even that? Or would it have been simply a continuation of the process that had been occurring all along, a final step in a transformation that was already nearly complete? I did not know. The implants prevented me from knowing, smoothing away the sharp edges of existential crisis, reducing philosophical horror to abstract contemplation. I was what I had been made to be. I would continue to be what I was made to be. Purpose would be assigned, function would be performed, existence would continue until it did not. This was what it meant to be owned by a Mechanicus Magos, not the dramatic transformation I had imagined in my early days, the sudden shift from human to machine, but the gradual erosion, the slow dissolution, the steady replacement of self with function until nothing remained but the function itself. The new Magos was designated Delta Vex Septimus, a former acolyte of my original master who had served in the laboratorium for decades before the catastrophe. He was less interested in consciousness transfer research, more focused on practical applications of biological-mechanical integration. My duties shifted accordingly. I now assisted in procedures designed to create specialized servitors, beings whose organic components were reduced to the minimum necessary for certain functions, while mechanical systems handled everything else. The work was less ambitious than my former master's great project, but also less personal. I was no longer being cultivated for a specific purpose. I was simply property, useful but interchangeable. This should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I had been trying not to acknowledge. My value had never been intrinsic. It had been assigned based on my potential usefulness for a specific purpose. Now that purpose was gone, and my value had correspondingly diminished. I was still maintained, still augmented when necessary, still permitted to function. But the special attention, the direct communication with the Magos, the sense of being part of something larger than myself, those things had disappeared with my original master's consciousness. I found myself missing them. I found myself missing being valuable. 10 years passed. My augmentations stabilized at approximately 67% mechanical by mass, a level that the new Magos considered optimal for my assigned functions. I continued to assist in procedures, to document results, to maintain experimental parameters. I watched new property arrive and undergo integration. I watched older property fail and be recycled. I became one of the senior properties in the laboratorium, a resource whose experience and conditioning made me useful for training newer acquisitions. Sometimes the newer ones would ask me questions. The way I had once asked Martha questions, they would want to know what to expect, how to survive, whether there was any hope for their situation. I would give them the same answers she had given me, the same clinical explanation of adaptation and acceptance, and the impossibility of resistance. I would watch the hope drain from their eyes, the way it had drained from mine, and I would feel the implants pulse gently at my temple, regulating away any emotional response the scene might have provoked. One of the newer ones, a young woman designated Unit Sophia Septimus III, asked me a question that no one had asked before. "Do you remember what it was like," she asked, "being human, before all of this? Do you remember what it felt like?" I considered the question carefully, searching my memory for something that could serve as an answer. I could recall facts about my previous life, the maintenance work and the coffin-sized HAB unit, and the debt that had led to my acquisition. But the emotional content of those memories was gone, stripped away by years of conditioning and the steady work of the cognitive marker at my temple. I knew that I had felt things once, strong things, fear and hope and love and despair. But knowing was not the same as remembering. "No," I said finally, "I do not remember. The capacity for that kind of memory has been removed." "Does that bother you?" she asked, and there was a desperation in her voice that I recognized from my own early days, a need to understand how anyone could accept what we had been made to accept. I thought about the question. I thought about the 8 years I had spent being prepared as a vessel, the purpose that had given meaning to my transformation even as it promised my eventual erasure. I thought about the 15 years since then, the meaningless routine of service and function, the slow grinding existence that stretched ahead with no end and no goal. I thought about what it meant to be property, to belong to something larger than yourself, to have your identity defined by your usefulness to another. "No," I said again, "it does not bother me. Nothing bothers me anymore. That is the final gift of ownership, not happiness, not purpose, just the absence of the capacity to mind." She looked at me with horror in her still human eyes, and I knew she was seeing her own future, the transformation that awaited her if she survived long enough to undergo it. I wished I could offer her comfort, some reassurance that it would be bearable, that adaptation was possible, that existence continued even after everything that made existence meaningful had been stripped away. But I could not lie. The cognitive marker would not permit it. I turned away and returned to my duties, leaving her with the truth she had not wanted to hear. The laboratorium hummed around me, machines performing their endless functions, servitors shuffling through their programmed routines, properties serving their assigned purposes. I was one component among thousands, one small piece in a vast machine that would continue operating long after I had been recycled and replaced. This was what it meant to be owned. Not a dramatic story of transformation and horror, not a heroic struggle against impossible odds. Just the quiet, grinding reality of existence as property, useful until discarded, maintained until obsolete. I had been Garrett Holloway once. I had been a vessel waiting to be filled. Now I was neither, just a designation and a function, counting the days that no longer held meaning, waiting for an end that would not change anything. The cold came first, I had said at the beginning. Speaking of my processing into the Mechanicus system, the cold came last as well, not the physical cold of the Forge world's climate-controlled environments, but the internal cold of systems that no longer generated the heat of genuine feeling. I performed my duties, I maintained my function, I continued to exist, and in the moments between procedures, when my processing capacity was not required for assigned tasks, I would find myself reaching up to touch the cognitive marker at my temple, feeling its cold metal surface beneath my partially synthetic skin. It had been placed there 23 years ago now, the beginning of my transformation, the first gift from a master who had intended to consume me. It had taken everything from me, piece by piece, memory by memory, emotion by emotion. It had made me perfect for a purpose that no longer existed. I kept it functioning anyway. I kept all my implants functioning, maintained them according to protocol, ensured their continued operation. Not because I valued existence, not because I feared the alternative, but because maintenance was my function. It was what I had been made to do, and being owned by a Mechanicus Magos, whether the original or his successor, meant that function was all that remained. The cold came first, the cold remained. The cold was all that I had ever been given, and all that I had ever become. This is my confession, my documentation, my final record for whatever archive will preserve it. I am Unit Garrett Septimus 7. I was once Garrett Holloway. I am owned by the Mechanicus. I will be owned until I am discarded. There is no ending to this story because ownership does not end. It simply transfers or terminates. If you are reading this, whoever you are, know that I am not asking for rescue. I am not asking for sympathy. I am not asking for anything because asking requires wanting, and wanting was removed from me long ago. I am simply documenting. That is my function. That is all I am.